Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's ZNCD Climate Action webinar, Smart Carbon Goals, Lessons Learned in the Construction of a Carbon Calculator. AIA California has developed the Climate Action webinar series to address various climate action topics, including zero net carbon design mandatory continuing education. We will provide links in the chat box where you can find our climate action webinars and free ZNCD on-demand education. To qualify for continuing education credit, AIA California provides learning objectives for every webinar and includes them in the PDF presentation that can be made available online. A few quick housekeeping reminders. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted on the AIA California website, www.aiacalifornia.org, along with any additional resources. Today's session qualifies for 1.5 AIA HSW learning units and zero net carbon design mandatory continuing education for those who stay on and watch live. AIA California staff will report these units for you and will send you a ZNCD certificate of completion. It can take several weeks before credits are posted and certificates are received. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions for today's presenters. You can also like a question to move it to the top of the queue. Finally, cultivate a positive learning environment. AIA California sincerely acknowledges the professional expertise our volunteer presenters provide. We greatly appreciate the diversity of perspectives and recognize that items presented in today's session may elicit a variety of responses. We strongly encourage attendees to be constructive in their comments and questions to the presenters and to one another to ensure we have a session that is productive and an environment that is a positive learning experience for everyone. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar. Simone Barth, Associate AIA. With over 19 years of professional experience and strong interest in craft and innovation, Simone's talents lies in the synthesis of management, strong design sensibility, and uncompromising attention to detail. She contributed to the planning and execution of a wide range of award-winning civic, academic, urban, and campus planning projects. A dedicated collaborator, she has the enthusiasm and energy to develop and execute complex planning and design solutions appropriate to the history of the building, site, and climate. Simone is currently an associate principal at Methuen, a member of USGBCLA, and a co-chair of the AIA California Climate Action Advocacy Committee. And I will now hand it over to Simone. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone, and thank you for your time and passion in our program today. Smart Carbon Goals, Lessons Learned in the Construction of a Carbon Calculator. The ZNCD session will provide a behind-the-scenes look at the development of Build Carbon Neutral version 2.0 calculator and how to incorporate the lessons learned at Methuen and across the broader industry in the 15 years since its debut in 2007. Leveraging industry research, Methuen's internal project database, and iterative parametric modeling, the updated BCN calculator will better address complex construction types, specific structural quantities, site design, and above-ground biomass for simplified carbon assessments of comparative elements of buildings and sites, and the specific elements of design that can be influenced for a lower carbon footprint. And I'm excited to introduce you to our speakers today, my valued colleagues. Our first speaker is Sean Cryan. Sean has worked on a wide variety of project typologies, from hospitals and institutional buildings to multifamily residential and green infrastructure projects. Sean served on the Washington State Commission looking into potential changes to our SEPA regulations related to embodied carbon, and worked with the City of Seattle and King County Commission on the development of an embodied carbon and transportation carbon calculator for use in assessing the overall impact of planning and construction on carbon emissions. Since 2004, Sean has been head of Methuen's annual office carbon footprint count, and in 2005, he began work on the Build Carbon Neutral calculator, which Methuen has hosted online since 2007. In 2020, Methuen began work on an update to that calculator, and Sean has been leading the R&D team in that effort. Our next and additional speaker, Claire McConnell, BEMP, is a building performance modeler and analyst at Methuen with a passion for deep green building design. Her holistic approach to sustainability leverages climate-based passive and active building strategies, whole building energy simulation, daylighting analysis, thermal comfort analysis, and whole building life cycle assessment. Her master's in sustainable architecture from the Norwegian Institute of Science and Technology and undergraduate background in civil engineering give her strong problem-solving capabilities and a unique perspective on the architecture industry. At Mithun, Claire works collaboratively across architecture and engineering disciplines to optimize project goals and elevate sustainability through building performance and simulation analysis. Thank you both for joining us today. Sean, please take it away.
Thanks, Simone. I will share my screen now with the start of the calculator. Sorry. Okay, does that look good?
Yeah.
Okay. So the construction calculator, well, for today, we'll be talking a little bit about the original genesis of buildcarbonneutral.org, or BCN version 1. We're going to give you a little bit of an overview of the in-process version 2, and some of the complexities and thoughts that led to the improvements that we're making to the calculator. Talk a little bit about some of the other BIM-based and web-based calculators, and we'll have some Q&A at the end. But the original carbon calculator did start actually with a project we were working on in 2004. We were working with the Lloyd District and the Planning Commission in the city of Portland, Oregon, looking at one of the districts they had there, and if they could make that into a sustainable district. Look at how that might develop over time, what mixed-use development could work there, but also about what the environmental impacts would be there. Could we create a district systems that would treat our wastewater for that area? What is the sweet spot for those kind of treatment areas? And also then what our water use and energy use would be. And one of the ways we were looking at that was, well, how much water falls on that site or the combined site in the district? Can we balance out our water budget so that we're working within that? We did similar studies for energy and energy generation opportunities. And there was one thing that we weren't able to figure out for that initial study, and that was the embodied carbon for the buildings that would be built and the infrastructure that would be built there. This was in 2004. George W. Bush was president at the time. It was a very long time ago, relatively speaking, to everyone's understanding of embodied carbon and the importance of it. In terms of embodied carbon for buildings, operational carbon is still a larger impact overall, but the embodied carbon is interesting because in the life cycle of a building, that embodied carbon is a very big chunk that happens during the initial construction. So especially as we have a time constraint to getting to reducing carbon in buildings overall, the more we built, the worse it was happening at the beginning time period. So when we were looking at what embodied carbon is in buildings one of the things you have to do is set the system boundaries. What are you trying to measure? And at the time, what we were looking at was basically harvest, or the equivalent of manufacturing, the early phase of a project, up to the gate. We looked at, and this will be discussed a little bit more later, but we were looking at getting the materials to the site. Once you get to the site, there are a lot of complexities there. The first summer intern and I worked on for the entire summer, figuring out what the carbon was that was involved in moving a cubic yard of soil on a site. And that's where we realized we needed to start to be a little bit more precise in defining what our system boundaries were and what the limitations and opportunities for the tool were. And when we're talking about embodied carbon, we're talking about something called carbon intensity ratio. So carbon intensity ratio means the amount of CO2 that will be released in the manufacturing and delivery of certain materials to the project site. It's a little bit deceptive because, for example, a metric ton of steel produces a couple of metric tons of CO2. And this is showing CO2 at the standard pressure and temperature, basically at sea level. So in that sort of pure form, you can see steel has a pretty large footprint compared to concrete or wood. But when you start doing life cycle analysis, you take that carbon intensity ratio and you start looking at it relative to the use of those materials in buildings. So steel is a very efficient material. So in terms of the overall impact of a concrete building, all concrete, it's got a higher carbon intensity ratio than steel or some sort of mixed system or wood might have. So that was one of the things that we started to try to incorporate into the original calculator. The other thing that we hadn't seen before we were trying to create was something that looked at the site carbon impact. There's a carbon cycle that involves the soil as well. And in a construction, there's a movement between soil, plants growing, roots depositing carbon within the soil, above ground biomass that might go into other systems like agricultural systems, and then that gets reintroduced into the soil. And through oxidation and respiration, some of that also goes into the biosphere. The other part of that, though, that we were trying to figure out was, well, with that 1 cubic yard of soil that we're moving around, how we were impacting, the things that were below grade. So one of the things we looked at was, well, in different types of landscapes, there's a different amount of below grade or soil sequestration of carbon as opposed to the above ground biomass. So for example, in a peat system, there's a great deal of storage of carbon in peat and a very little amount of the more fungible biomass that's above grade. We chose to limit our options for that a little bit as well in the original calculator, and also give options because those numbers vary once you start looking at your ecoregion. Different ecoregions have the different reactions to landscape and soil. The carbon calculator was a team effort from the beginning and continues to be so. In the initial calculator, Mithun worked with the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center at the University of Texas, Austin. They were the ones that really helped us out with that below the soil sequestration of carbon, above ground biomass, and analyzing that. And then we had a series of interns, both from the University of Washington and later on from Washington State University, as well as some other universities. One of the Washington State University students actually went on in her master's degree study to try and give more information than what was available initially. And she was actually on a construction site and doing very complex analysis of truck idling, which turns out to be a big part of the on-site construction activities and the complexities of that as well. At the time, though, what we had available to us was a more limited set of data sources for information about the various materials that go into a building. We relied pretty heavily on the University of Bath in the United Kingdom. They had a mechanical engineering department that does a really great job of listing out carbon intensity ratios. So even with that steel number that I was using earlier, or the concrete number, they start to break it down into much, looking at variance within steel production, variance in concrete production, et cetera. So they have, as a resource, they continue to be an excellent resource for people doing life cycle analysis. And then the other one, because there wasn't a lot of information about it, sort of one of the really early people looking at this as an issue was the Pliny Fisk at the Center for Maximum Potential Building Systems, coincidentally also in Austin, who published a series of papers that looked at embodied carbon and started to look at ratios in general ways of the main structure to the interior build out to furniture and other pieces of the puzzle there. So we relied on their databases quite a bit. And the goal of that, the calculator itself, was to really create a simple to use educational tool that really, that from the very beginning of a project, you could just to get people to into the idea of, well, what is embodied carbon? What is my building impact? So we really limited the number of input points that you would need to enter into the calculator, and made some very gross general assumptions that we'll also talk about a little bit later in terms of how they vary now. The calculator itself, we were aiming for an accuracy of plus or minus 25%. The first, when better tools were developed later on, the first tally model that we did and compared to our calculator, we were within 2%. So we were feeling really good about that until there was another one that was off by about 200%. So again, it was more of an educational tool than a fine-tuning tool, but the number of 200% at the time also was interesting. We were trying to figure out, how accurate calculators could be. And so at that time, I actually took my family our data and put it into a series of calculators that were available online for personal carbon. And we did find that Al Gore had us at the lowest possible number, and the Climate Care actually had doubled that. So one of the things was to understand that there is a certain amount of variability in any of these calculators as you go along. And one of the benefits is, if you're trying to get to a reduction, is to look to try and get relatively similar tools that you can cross-check any changes and things that you make. So again, our tool is intended as an educational tool, an introductory tool, and not something that would really be the be-all end-all like Tally and EC3 have become in terms of getting to much finer kind of detailing of it. So this is that buildcarbonneutral.org is the website that we established then, and will continue to be the website for the tool. I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll tell you a little bit more about where we've gone from there.
Yes, thank you, Sean. I am going to get us started. On the redevelopment of the Build Carbon Neutral calculator. So first of all, just getting us all up to speed again. Sean covered some of this already, but why do we care about embodied carbon? Well, in order to combat climate change, we're really trying to reduce emissions from here on out, having emissions peak today, or as this graph says, really back in 2020, and then reduce and hit net zero by 2040. And so, like Sean said, the embodied carbon in a project is carbon that is emitted day one of building occupancy. And so these are emissions that have already been in the atmosphere, and while operational energy can exceed the embodied emissions of a building, those are emissions that are incrementally built up over time, as opposed to embodied carbon, which is emitted by day one of our project. It's also important to realize that as we've really been dialing in our energy efficiency strategies, that the share of the carbon footprint that's attributed to embodied carbon grows. And so these days, when we're talking about a high performing building, about 80% of that embodied carbon 80% of the total carbon footprint is embodied carbon in the first couple decades of a project's life. 2030 challenge, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. This has become, at least in the US, a staple for firms in trying to tackle climate change in the architecture industry. These days, 2030 challenge is also now including reporting for embodied carbon. So if you haven't already been trying to assess embodied carbon on your projects, you will be starting soon. And we have seen, even in this year's AIA 2030 reporting, you can see this chunk of projects that were reporting embodied carbon is still very small, but Build Carbon Neutral was by far the #1 calculator for assessing what a project's embodied carbon is. So we know it is a widely used tool even today, 15 years later, which is also what prompted us to update the calculator to really incorporate all these things we've been learning about embodied carbon over the last 15 years and make it a more accurate tool and a more useful tool for measuring embodied carbon today. As Sean mentioned, it's always been a collaborative effort. So this Build Carbon Neutral version 2.0 update is a internal Methuen research and development project, but we have also had support from an AIA Upjohn research grant, and we are collaborating with others, including KPFF's Seattle office, to really help fill in the gaps, especially around building structure, knowing that there's more expertise out there for us to lean on. So we wanted to share a few of the big lessons learned that we wanted to include in this update of the calculator. We have been tracking embodied carbon on our projects over the last 10 years or so, really trying to ramp up whole building life cycle assessment and building our own project embodied carbon database. And this has been a really valuable tool for us in both determining what types of strategies have been really effective in reducing embodied carbon on projects, also to see progress, and also to identify carbon hotspots across our building typologies. So here you can see, over time we have, well, thankfully it's good to see we have been able to bring down the embodied carbon average of our concrete and steel structure projects. We've also increased the use of wood. We have far more timber projects than we have in the past, and also recognizing that hybrid structures can really go a long ways in combining the efficiencies in these different types of structures. So where we need to use concrete and steel, we will use concrete and steel, but where timber might be available, for example, as an above grade structure, combining those into a hybrid structural system type has really helped to reduce our embodied carbon. So beyond structure, we've also been learning about envelope and enclosure. And looking here just as an example at cladding, we had a little internal Methuen wall embodied carbon competition where all our active projects could submit their primary wall type, and we looked at per square foot or per meter squared of wall, what was our embodied carbon impact. And you can see both framing type, but especially your exterior cladding can really or I guess I should say really represents a range of embodied carbon, whether we're working with brick or our wood siding. You'll see here some of these are negative, which is indicating the carbon that is stored in wood as it grows. We'll be mentioning more about bio-based materials later. And then we've also been seeing that our interior scope on projects can be a pretty significant chunk of the overall embodied carbon. This depends a little bit on what our structure looks like, but just like our operational versus embodied energy, as we really optimize the embodied carbon of our more carbon intensive materials like concrete in particular, and also steel. Maybe these buildings here are showing hybrid and wood structural systems. So as we are using more carbon friendly structural materials, more carbon friendly enclosure materials, we start to see this chunk from interiors play a bigger role in our embodied carbon footprints. And so really, we can distill this down into trying to pay attention to materials that require high energy to manufacture, which we're seeing are including concrete, metals, brick, and insulation, among others, but those are the, in particular, the hot spots. Materials used in high volume or with high rates of turnover, for example, tenant improvement work that maybe your interior office gets stripped and rebuilt every 10 to 20 years. So things like carpet, gypsum wallboard, although on a per kilogram or per meter cubed basis are not very carbon intensive, we do use them in such high volumes that they can and are showing up as carbon hotspots in our projects. And then our bio-based materials, which really are helping us get down to zero. So again, anything that is storing carbon in its life cycle as it grows before we use it as a building product gets a carbon credit. And so, there is, of course, energy going into the manufacturing of wood products, but a lot of times, especially for sourcing these from sustainably managed forests, where the carbon ecosystem goes beyond just an individual tree, we really are able to store more carbon than we use in producing a wood material. I hand it back over to Sean for a minute.
Okay. So it's interesting, when Claire talks about the bio-based materials, one of the things that we realized when we were looking at the system limits of the calculator is that just, in terms of the landscape part of that, the early planting of trees, planting of other materials, there's energy expended in that. They are sequestering very small amounts of carbon early on, but if you can see the fine line here for the arc of carbon in the plant materials and landscaping, they really start out as a carbon source. And it's not until a number of years into the growth cycle that they actually get to the point where they're net zero, and then where they start sequestering carbon, as the plants continue to grow. The other thing that does happen within that cycle is this part of the end of life of a plant. The above ground biomass can go to a variety of different places. So that's something that does need to be accounted for, although it's a future release of carbon. But it's something that just we had to take into mind when we were starting to look at the calculator and what we were going to be representing in the calculator for landscape and plant systems. We're not saying you shouldn't be planting trees, et cetera. No, we are a firm that is a multidisciplinary firm, including landscape architecture, interiors, architecture, planning. And there's so many benefits between habitat, the heat island, just creating different, promoting different types of biohabitats is really important. But we do want to acknowledge that there's a certain release and that before you get to a sink. I think in terms of the biomaterials as well, one of the assumptions that we make when we are showing a bio-based building material rather, is that it was sustainably harvested and replanted, so that there is new above ground biomass and below grade soil sequestration happening to help compensate for some of that as well. how do I advance when okay, so yeah, so this was the looking at the how that system will work then, and why we're sort of focusing on something that Claire will look at in more depth. But the early, basically from harvest to cradle to gate, as it's called. So in developing the Build Carbon Neutral version 2, there were some things that we really wanted to hold on to from the original calculator. One, it's open access, free to use, it's easy and fast. We're trying to make it where it's information that you might have even when you're doing a feasibility study for a project, trying to work with the kind of information that is very high level, so that you have some awareness of that embodied carbon early in the process. We really tried to simplify it. I think that chart that Claire showed, where a majority of the projects that are reporting right now are using Build Carbon Neutral, it's because, you know, the original one takes you 5 minutes to get an answer. There are a lot of smaller firms that don't have resources like we do at Mithun to do a lot of the research and study. And so, you know, we want to have the tool out there in both the simplified version and the more complex version available for people. Again, there was some complexity in the way that the original calculator was set up, so that we're trying to simplify our system boundaries, those boundaries that I was talking about before. So we're not doing a little bit of a mix of apples and oranges within the tool. And we're still trying to keep it as an early educational tool with a 25% more or less accuracy rate for looking at carbon emissions. So if we look at that as an overall diagram of the tool, Build Carbon Neutral version 2.0 is now this entire sort of framework within the tool. And you can see the parts that are circled in orange are really, you know, we extrapolated from those two little orange boxes initially to get the full range of information for a building. So if we compare, there we go. If we compare then the sort of primary and secondary inputs to the calculator, and in the initial calculator, you put in how many square feet you had, and the tool just assumed that it was equally distributed. So every building was a rectangle. You know, you put in how many stories were above ground, how many stories were below ground. That allowed us to take into account some of the below grade biomass, as well as that excavation number for a project that I had mentioned earlier. That was probably one of the exceptions to that rule of cradle to gate, that we were looking at what you were digging. And then you just put in a primary structural system. And then on landscape, it was just how much did you disturb? How much did you install? You know, what was the nature of the existing that you disturbed? And what was the nature of the installed vegetation, as well as what ecoregion you're in. So that has also changed. And although this looks a lot more complicated, there are more data points, it was still trying to simplify it to the point where, you know, in the new calculator on a building now, you can have an upper section that might be a different structural system than your podium or your below grade kind of work. So for each of those areas, we have inputs that, you know, that you can look at, including the number of stories, including, you know, what your perimeter is per story, what your floor to floor level, glazing percentage, all of those things that can allow us to factor in a little bit more precise information about what kind of footprint you might have. So similarly, then there's a secondary input for each of those that gives you the you know, options for even some reduction opportunities with concrete mix and what kind of roof types and things. They're just a little bit more information that should still be relatively easy to grab out of an early design kind of model or even proposal. And then we've added the whole section now on interiors. You know, Claire was showing some of the studies that we've done on interiors. So we're trying to create some typologies for that as well, to still have it be fairly simplified for the user, but give you a better idea of what your building might be contributing for interiors, even including, whether you're leaving things raw to structure or adding a lot of materials to that. And we're trying to figure out an opulence factor, something that can take into account the fact that, if you're doing a very expensive building, likelihood is that materials might be traveling from greater distances or might have a higher carbon footprint. It won't take into account if there's the higher cost potentially of a low carbon material, but that's for the user to define in terms of their opulence. And then for the landscape as well, there's quite a bit more complexity, although the main landscape part of it is pretty much the same. We're giving an option for a percentage of each type of vegetation that might be going into the project. Previously, people had to kind of gerrymander or bootstrap themselves for that. But what we're really excited about with that, and we'll talk about a little bit more, is that we're looking at also options for hardscape. So, you have a project, you've got vehicle paving, you've got pedestrian paving. So how that might factor into it. Are you going to talk to this one, Claire, or should I?
Either.
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Yeah, what makes us unique, some of you may see there are more and more embodied carbon calculators advertised out there these days, some with paywalls, some that are also open access. And so in embarking on this redevelopment, we really did want to make sure that we were providing a unique product and not reinventing the wheel. So as we see it, one of the especially unique pieces of Build Carbon Neutral is that it is combining all of these elements: structure, enclosure, interiors, and the site and landscape. Most calculators out there are evaluating either buildings or landscape. And then we're also, as Sean was mentioning, with this division of your upper structure versus a podium if it exists and below grade structure, we're trying to differentiate the building structure and enclosure to include some consideration of building massing. We have added this interior scope and trying to include building use or typology in our amount of finishes, and the opulence factor, as Sean coined, which is a term that I love because I think it captures the sort of crux of interiors embodied carbon really well. And then we also want to make sure that when we are reporting these results, it's not just a one number. Right now, the Build Carbon Neutral calculator is reporting a single embodied carbon number, but again, in line with wanting this to be an educational tool, we want to be able to provide that breakdown by material or by category, building element, to really help people identify carbon hotspots in their building and where to most effectively mitigate embodied carbon moving forward. Okay, so just wanted to mention too, talking about life cycle assessment in the design process. Generally, we want this to be able to be a tool for anyone. So even those of you that are doing more advanced life cycle assessment work in Tally or in EC3, we still see, or other tools, we still see a role for the Build Carbon Neutral calculator. And particularly in that early concept, early schematic design phase, when you might not have a model, being able to independently get a sense of where your embodied carbon might sit. As we all know, once you get into the modeling, a lot of times some of these really important material decisions, especially around structure, are already more or less locked in. So being able to have that early phase tool that lets you compare is valuable. Later on, you might move into Tally in this mid SD or DD phase. You might start to dig in a little more specifically and a little more accurately, especially in terms of material quantities. And then you might move into the EC3 calculator or more specific EPD databases that will show you, again, a more precise picture of your embodied carbon based on the actual products you are planning on using in your design.
Claire, could you mention what an EPD data is?
Yes.
For the, yeah.
Yes, so an environmental product declaration, or EPD, is a transparency document that is put together preferably by a third party, but for a manufacturer, that is essentially taking in all of the inputs to a material. So both the actual raw materials needed to produce a building product, but also things like the energy required to manufacture that product. And it's essentially doing a really detailed accounting of what are the environmental impacts. Usually these EPDs include more than just global warming potential, which is how we typically measure embodied carbon and operational carbon in our buildings. Our focus as an industry tends to be on carbon because it is typically the more critical environmental impact of our buildings, but EPDs will also tell you about resource use, water use, acidification potential, eutrophication potential, a whole number of other metrics to give you an idea of how that specific product, or in the case of industry average environmental product declarations, generally speaking, that material across the industry, how that is impacting our environment. So speaking of EPDs, they typically include all of these steps, which is here are little animations showing the full scope of an EPD. So we have these different material stages: stage A, stage B, stage C, stage D. Our build carbon neutral calculator, again, is focusing on this upfront A1 to A3 impacts. So from raw material extraction to material processing. We've left out some of these other stages for a couple of reasons. First, that these A stages tend to be the largest chunk of a product's embodied carbon. And so we're capturing the majority of the impact when we are focusing on these upfront impacts. It's also, there's still a lot of gray area and uncertainty around the use end of life and this module D sort of recyclability, any kind of credits to the system. And so we decided to leave that out of this, this calculator to really dial in on those emissions day one of building use. So diving in a little bit more now into these new features, starting first with structure. So we are aiming to provide more precision in structural system types. So that includes both allowing for hybrid structures, but also, as Sean and I have mentioned, really partitioning our buildings, especially structure, into below grade, any sort of podium level, and an upper building structure, recognizing that even, you know, most of our Methuen projects are built this way with a podium and another type of upper above grade structure. And then we also, again, wanting this to be an educational tool and to provide dials to turn to see, you know, how might this design option or this choice affect our embodied carbon. We want to make sure that we're including some low global warming potential GWP material options. So that's going to include things like cement replacement, steel variants. So, you know, even within steel, we can have a range of embodied impact based on the manufacturing process. And then we also wanted to integrate this with landscape. And so we are planning to include structural considerations for green roofs, especially as green roofs become more popular as a sustainability strategy for carbon, but especially for other you know, impacts like stormwater or biophilia. Speaking to enclosure, we now want to include different options for cladding types, for glazing percentage, and then also for that envelope thickness. We know that insulation can be a hot spot, and so we want to make sure that we are giving a more precise picture of that embodied carbon of the enclosure, particularly when folks might compare this to operational energy. This is one place where, you know, a thicker envelope might help your operational energy, but you're also going to have a higher carbon footprint. So being able to compare those numbers might be useful. And then on the interiors, we are looking at here, we've sort of sketched out 3 different potential interior schemes going from lowest carbon to highest carbon. And we're seeing really that the amount of finished material and the type of finished material, as well as the density of interiors. So whether you have an open office or a lot of enclosed offices, you know, this can really, really fluctuate your interior carbon impact. And again, this opulence factor, one of the places we've seen this most in our own practice, and what really got us thinking about this term, is looking at our market rate versus affordable housing projects, and just looking at both the way that finished materials are chosen or not chosen. If, you know, we are, say, looking for more efficiency in material use, generally speaking, we tend to see fewer finished materials in our affordable housing projects than our market rate projects, and also more thought to material durability, and so counting on a lower turnover rate. So trying to figure out some factor that can try to capture these types of decision making in projects. And then our landscape pieces, we are seeing a pretty significant impact of hardscape. And I think hardscape in general tends to be something that is overlooked even by, and you know, we're also speaking about ourselves, even by folks that are really dialed into life cycle assessment in project design. A lot of times we're really focused on the concrete mix design in our buildings, and then we give little to no thought of the concrete mix used in our site design. And so trying to bring attention to that, looking at concrete mix design for vehicular and pedestrian paving, other types of paved materials, whether that's asphalt, something else. And then again, looking at landscape and the ability to sequester carbon in our above ground biomass. So this is a little bit of a convoluted roadmap that we've sketched out for ourselves. The orange there is our steps that we've completed to date. We're going to zoom in on this corner here on the right that you see has a little bit of an iterative element to it. which is where we are currently. And then again, recognizing that we are working on the redevelopment of the original Build Carbon Neutral. In trying to develop this version 2, we've had a lot of discussion about what is included and what might get kicked down the road for a version 3. So when this calculator is released, I think we are all assuming that this is the end for now only.
And that we'll be trying for version 3 sometime before the next 15 years pass.
Right.
You know, have a slightly more rapid development process for the future versions. Yeah.
So I apologize for the amount of text on this screen, but we wanted to give you an idea. We're really excited about this process that we have developed in order to build this background data set that the calculator will rely on. So we've started with identifying what all these new user inputs will be. And this map here is showing you essentially where we are now in the process, which is using Grasshopper to parametrically generate case studies based on user inputs. And, you know, this is letting us really maximize the number of case studies we can use to build values that the calculator will ultimately run from. So instead of just relying on, for example, the Methuen projects to date, we've been able to benchmark with life cycle assessment. We're now able to really quickly and iteratively build these different shapes and sizes and types of models for analysis, all of which, you know, get exported in some fashion to Excel in terms of material quantities. And from there, we can start to organize these material quantities and apply emission factors, which we're pulling from either Carbon Leadership Forum, material baselines, EC3 or Tally, depending on data quality. We're really trying to drill into what factors best represent the industry average for this particular material or element we're looking at. And then eventually all of this will get aggregated, binned, and stored to develop a background data set in Excel that the calculator will be able to use to spit out results. So we just wanted to add a note on understanding the math, as we're calling it. So some of the ways that we are trying to increase precision and just in general, develop that background math for this redevelopment. We are using SE 2050 as a resource for figuring out what these structural quantities should be, whether you're mass timber or concrete or a steel building. There are guidelines on what a typical bay size might look like. And so we are trying to build to these sort of standardized structural rules of thumb. And then, as Sean mentioned, the original calculator did not take into account any sort of building massing. It was really, you put in a square footage and it's assuming it's a perfect square or a rectangle. And this diagram here is just showing you, these are all 10,000 square feet. But how that 10,000 square feet is massed really can have a pretty big influence on what that perimeter looks like. And so if you can imagine these as little floor plates that are extruded, obviously here your 700 or 680, 700 linear foot perimeter, you're going to have a much higher area of cladding than you would in this 400 linear foot perimeter. And so trying to come up with these ways to really differentiate and add precision to the calculator upgrade. Sean, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say on this one in particular, it was really, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and I just didn't realize the degree of impact massing might have on the perimeter. You know, contractors are always telling you, oh, it's costing more because they have more corners, or, you know, there's certain things, parlance in the industry, but it was really important for us to find a stand-in that you as practitioners could use in the tool to help it become more accurate. So that perimeter, after going through a bunch of different options for how do we figure this out, including making our Grasshopper parametric model live, so it was actually creating the things that you guys would be working on, we realized, well, really all we needed was the area of outside wall. And so this was the best way we could find to approximate that in the tool in a way that didn't make it onerous for people who were using the tool to come up with a reasonable number for what they're working on.
And then I know we're getting close on time here, but just a note on how we're developing these carbon intensity ratios. We have this somewhat complex equation down here that's just showing how we are trying to combine, for example, in the enclosure, these different layers of materials. You know, including your emission factor for cladding, the continuous insulation, and again, we having to take into account an R value or a thickness of that insulation, your sheathing, all these different layers that go into that exterior envelope, and trying to do all that background math so that ultimately the calculator will be able to map to a specific envelope emission factor per square foot, so that you know, we're doing the complex math ahead of time so that that calculator in the end will be more simplified for the user, but also then that background data set that it is pulling from. And then we hope this will be a really useful page for you all. We, again, you know, speaking to all these different calculators, all of these on the right are calculators that we are either excited about or have used or use actively on projects in combination with other tools. On the left here, we have some general resources, and one we really wanted to highlight was the Carbon Leadership Forum. This is a group out of UW that has really kind of taken over the embodied carbon world in terms of, or in the building industry anyways. They have a lot of really great resources on their webpage. They have more information about all of these calculators. They also have regional hubs, and so we really encourage you guys to reach out. I think Simone will drop a link in the chat to the regional hub page. And these are all forums across the US in particular, where practitioners are sharing knowledge. They often have webinars monthly. It's a really, really great source of information. But as you can see, there's a lot of calculators out there for, you know, a wide range of different applications. And I think bottom line is any one of us are really just hoping that you all as practitioners, if you haven't been already, start paying attention to embodied carbon on your projects and start to measure and figure out ways to really mitigate embodied carbon on our projects. And with that, I think we'll turn it back over. Oh, yes. Yeah,
I just add to that, in terms of the other calculators, there are many we didn't list there. again, there's a bigger list on the CLF Carbon Leadership Forum website. And so that, there are different tools that all address different aspects. There's one that allows you to look at your operational carbon and weigh that against your embodied carbon, giving you an overall piece. They all have different benefits depending on what you're looking to do. So if you're interested in it, I highly recommend kind of diving into each of those. I find it fascinating, but we kind of geek out about this sort of stuff. But I think it is something, the more you know about it, the more interesting I think it is.
Wonderful. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A and also in the chat box. So hopefully we can address them all. In case we can't, then we'll respond back to you. I think, you may have mentioned it, but people are interested in when is version 2 released? Is it already released? When is it coming out?
It is not released. I think Claire had the slide that was sort of showing where we are in the process right now. Realistically, our goal is 2023, and that's a big year. It won't be early in 2023. We're trying to be quite a bit more precise than I was the first time, and the first time actually was a 2-year process. So I think we're about 1.5 years in right now. We will notify all avenues of communication possible when it does come out. I'm looking forward to it as well. And I should say that the new one, we're looking at keeping the original Coke and the Coke new formula both active, so that you'd still be able to use a really, really abbreviated calculator, as well as the one if you want to go more in depth.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, that's going to be very exciting. So I go down the questions as they were listed. The first one is from Debbie. How do you address the energy code requirements for insulation versus embodied carbon? Claire, you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah. We have been toying with, is that a more automated box where, based on your climate zone, are we assuming a specific R value, and from that determining an insulation thickness? And I think, where we've landed is really letting the user input R values for your envelope, so that we can capture that thickness. And again, we don't currently in the original or in this update plan to have operational carbon in the results. It's really diving in and focusing on that embodied carbon. But part of that was, knowing that there are such a suite of tools and practices already out there that are measuring operational energy, and our operational carbon is really tied to how much energy we use and what type of energy. And so being able to give users in this update an idea of how that R value will affect the embodied carbon of the enclosure, but then that would be on the user to compare that to your operational energy use. And so we know there is a trade-off there, but yeah, we again, in trying to keep it somewhat simple, we didn't really want to dive too far down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's important to note is that different insulations do have different embodied carbon. At Methuen, there are certain insulation types that we try to focus on because they have lower embodied carbon. So we're also trying to sort out how to reflect that as maybe an option or something, so you can see how those would compare. Recently, I've seen there's now paper-based insulation available from Germany, I think, and they're looking at starting to manufacture that in the US as well. So that's the other thing that's happening simultaneous to all of this, is that, the awareness of embodied carbon and the need for reducing carbon emissions during manufacturing means that there are a lot of manufacturers that are looking at reducing the carbon impact of their materials, which will help in a huge way with the reduction in buildings overall.
Very good. I'm jumping around a little bit because I think this goes in a similar direction. Jamie Spencer is with public bidding with a low bidder. How do you get them to comply with embodied carbon when they're seeking the lowest price? I mean, it ties into the specification and the type of materials.
That sounds like one for me, probably, right, Claire?
Yeah.
You go ahead, Sean, and I'll see if I have anything to add.
Okay. It's a tough thing. I mean, it's not just a low bid project. I mean, for all projects that we're working on, prices for materials have gone up a huge amount in just the last year. So we have the benefit a lot of the times of having fairly motivated clients in that regard. Often if it's a public bid project, then it's a public agency or governmental agency. They have requirements now for sustainability. Those are starting to ramp up. And I'm sure if embodied carbon isn't part of that yet, it may be something that will be coming along the line. And the other thing I would say for that is that a publicly bid project is based on your contract documents, which includes a specification.
Yeah.
So for like we've all gotten used to, or most of us, I think, have gotten used to putting lead requirements into the specifications. It's possible to do that with embodied carbon now too. EC3 calculator is an amazing tool for seeing regionally where the low carbon materials are. You can plug in where you are. They can show you what concrete plants in your area have given out environmental product declarations that state what their embodied carbon is for the material. So I think, again, that this is sort of getting to a point, I think it's reached a point where the growth is kind of exponential in information. And I think that will help. But your specification, I think, is going to be the best element that, to have in a public bid.
And I think the only thing I'd add to that is just, before you even get there, this calculator might help you make those design decisions that are outside of your specifications, even just what's your structural system type, or within the specifications, what type of insulation are we showing preference for? And I think our general approach to sustainability, our kind of philosophy, especially on some of these pieces that we know are can have a cost impact or are harder to get sign off for, is really just to be able to present the information. So, it's just another layer. Like we would present a cost estimate, we can also present this carbon difference between two schemes, two products. And that is just one extra layer that's added to that final decision making.
Yeah, and I one more thing to add, actually. We can do this all day.
Yeah.
But I think that the other element of that is right now there's not a constraint on carbon. There's not been, some places have established carbon markets and, cap and trade kinds of systems. But if you've ever tried to offset carbon on a project, you'll see that the cost of carbon has been going up. And so if there is, if as regulations come in, that might cause an impact to the project financially in terms of having to do an offset, then the lower embodied carbon project can have a lower overall cost, not just the initial cost of construction.
Mm-hmm. So it really ties into the life cycle perspective of a material. That may tie us into the next question. I'm trying to organize them, but This is from Edward Dean. He says, I don't see how carbon credit can be taken for wood products from the beginning of the tree's lives in the forest. Shouldn't the accounting start with the harvesting at the beginning of the manufacturing process? Has there been discussion of this rationale among embodied carbon experts? And do you have a reference for this?
Yeah, biogenic carbon is what it's called, and it's probably the most hotly debated element. Claire, you want to? Yeah, I'll let you.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. It is hot button issue in life cycle assessment and carbon circles. Even just thinking about if you do take the credit, if let's just assume there is a credit to be taken, there's a lot of people that argue, and I think, we're among those, that you really can only capture, or you get that credit, yes, but then what happens at the end of life if you are disposing of that material, if it is burned, landfilled, all that carbon that the tree did store is emitted to the atmosphere anyways. And so especially if you are looking at whole building life cycle assessment through those end of life phases, which a lot of these tools like Tally do, that credit that you captured in the beginning in your upfront materials is now emitted back into the atmosphere. There's also a lot of talk about different biogenic factors. They call them upstream factors. So thinking even before harvesting, but just how is that forest managed? We mentioned it a little bit, and we can be sure of it qualitatively, but not so much quantitatively in embodied carbon accounting, but that a sustainably managed forest, something that might have an SFI or an FSC certification, the way that they are managing that forest is maximizing the amount of carbon in the entire ecosystem in its storage. So it's not just in the biomass above ground, but really having healthy soils that are capturing far more carbon than anything above ground does. And so there are a lot of people out there that are researching this. David Diaz is one of those tools that we mentioned. The upstream calculator is trying to look at that. In general, I think nobody has totally agreed on whether you should or shouldn't include it. I think the way that we approach it is often trying to think about what we're looking at, what we're measuring, how we're trying to communicate. And I think there's a parallel with looking at existing products. A lot of times if you're trying to compare a project that has an existing building that you retrofit versus a building that existing building that you're going to tear down and build up new again, figuring out a way to account for those differences. So in the baseline case, even though we're not actually building a new building, we might compare the demolition and construction of a new building to just the carbon required for the retrofit of the existing building. So in the same way, if we're looking at wood versus concrete, it's hard for me to say even there whether you should include it or not. I think you include it with a caveat, or I think some would say you include it only if you can be sure that you're sourcing it from a well-managed forest. I'm not sure we have a firm answer for you there.
Okay, thank you. Because I want to make sure we have like 15 more questions, so be prepared. The next question.
15 more minutes, so that's
we'll Tim Kohart, CO2 per square foot of construction is an important conversational metric, sort of like EUI, KBTU per square foot. Has there been any discussion of adding this metric into the calculator based on project inputs?
Yes, the output from the calculator will include a overall carbon metric. What we're trying to do with the output now is make it a little more transparent than it was originally, so we can look at different potential materials and their impacts, as well as then an overall carbon. And we're looking at also whether we're going to try and do both metric and imperial. So whether it's kilograms of CO2 per square foot or potentially kilograms of CO2 per square meter. I think we're going to try and do both. So, but yes, that will be part of the output as an overall number for the buildings.
Excellent, thank you. And then Rebecca is asking, some calculators are more suitable for either early or later design phases. Is your calculator appropriate for any design phase from concept to CD? I think you mentioned it, but it is suitable for all phases, but it's definitely very applicable for the early design phases. So we can move on to the next one. Seems flexible enough to add an offsite utilities module for construction on unimproved lots. I'm not quite sure exactly what the question is here.
It might be, I'm thinking, is it maybe a reference to if you've got to bring infrastructure to a remote area, for example, or something like that? It maybe is.
Yeah, I mean, maybe is it, yeah.
Yeah, and I think if that's the question, I don't think that that's something that we'll be able to address. That it's one of the system limits that I think we have to place on our calculator.
Okay, well, I hope that answered your questions. Otherwise, we'll follow up with you. An anonymous question is, what options are you considering for concrete replacement below grade?
Yeah, I think similar to the way we are thinking about framing things like an opulence factor with sort of a low, medium, high, I think we are planning on taking a similar approach there with cement replacement. And that will probably involve, again, we have our KPFF Seattle office collaborators to lean on here to really help us dial that in. But I think it'll entail looking at what's out there in terms of our projects, you know, what is achievable, things like the EC3 tool, and try to dial in a kind of low, medium, high replacement scenario, or in general, thinking about low global warming potential concrete, because we know it's not just the cement replacement that can do that, but your overall mix design, how much cement is in the mix to begin with. As Sean mentioned, also we wanting this to be an educational tool, we want this to be really transparent. So we are going to make sure that we are really detailing out our assumptions. What does it mean to be low GWP concrete? You know, here's what we're assuming when we say that. But yes, we are planning on including that because it is not everywhere, but especially up here in our area in the Pacific Northwest and even in California, it is pretty standard these days to have some degree of cement replacement. So we want to make sure that we're, you know, able to capture that within the calculator as well. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Next question from Jill Edelman. Is there guidance within the tool on what it assumes for small, medium, large rooms and levels of opulence?
There will be. Yes, I think that's an easy one. Yes, we will let people know, again, that transparency in education is important. So, you know, even for somebody to say, well, am I small, medium, or large? You know, to give the assumptions is a key component of what we'll be putting together.
Excellent. How do green roofs perform in carbon offset when evaluated against the added costs of embodied carbon to the increased structure and roofing, waterproofing material quantities and related carbon produced?
I think, as we alluded to before, it's a pretty, that's another one of those complex equations, because you know, we're not relying on above ground biomass or soil sequestration realistically in most green roofs. We have done some that were very intensive green roofs that actually, you know, there's a thick enough soil that's undisturbed that will be sequestering carbon. I think that the benefits there, you start to look at are you creating a habitat corridor? Are you including plants that are, beneficial for butterflies, bees, and birds.
Stormwater retention,
Yeah,
insulation
Claire mentioned,
value.
yeah.
Yes.
Yes, and then the heat island effect in urban environments as well. So I think on the embodied carbon argument, there's not a really strong one if you isolate that element. But I think if you look at it as a non-isolated element, there's still so many benefits to the green roofs that it outweighs the embodied carbon increase there.
Yeah.
And I think just as a Methuen team, over the last couple of years, we've had a lot of these conversations around landscape and embodied carbon, trying to account for sequestration. And, it's a little bit disappointing, but a good thing that we are coming to this, consensus as a team that the embodied carbon piece, the sequestering potential in landscape is actually pretty minimal, especially when you're comparing to something like the site hardscape. And so, for better or worse, I think that's one of the lessons learned that we are trying to capture in the calculator, because I think for so long we have always thought of landscaping and plants in general as being able to offset some of that carbon footprint. And I think what we're realizing is that that's actually a really, really small amount. And as we expand our life cycle assessment practice in general to include your interior scope, your mechanical systems, your site hardscape, that carbon bubble just keeps growing. And so I think we've sort of come to this conclusion that the benefits are less related to carbon and, or the carbon benefits are so much smaller, I should say, than all of the other benefits to biohabitats, stormwater, all these pieces.
Excellent. Another question from Jill. SE 2050 ESIDs don't include columns. Will BCN 2.0 account for these?
For columns? Yes. Yes. Yeah, the structure will include anything that's out there on those SE 2050. I don't think at this point we plan to necessarily break down each of the individual structural components, but we haven't gotten there. So I guess if we get a lot of feedback that we should, maybe we will. But in our grasshopper modeling, that we are, basing all of these structural quantities and modeling in general off of those SE 2050 diagrams, which includes column sizing and spacing.
Thank you. And then what does GWP mean?
GWP is global warming potential. And so that is the metric that we're typically measuring any sort of carbon emissions by. And we don't just say carbon because global warming potential captures all the other greenhouse gases normalized to carbon. So it is reported in kilograms of CO2 equivalents, but it is the general metric, and especially for embodied carbon, that you'll see thrown around out there.
And then Stephen Ball, what does the accountability side of the equation look like? Governmental review and approval process.
I'm not sure I understand that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say what we currently know is that, there's some form, depending on which state or municipality you're looking into, that are requiring embodied carbon reductions, or at least listings. We are, as AIA California, working on that as well, with individual municipalities as well as with the state. But as we already elaborated on it, currently it really is tied into a holistic view from the client as well as the design team, and then really balancing that with the tool, your drawing and your specifications, in case there is not a prescribed kind of minimum level set. That's as sparsely together the details that we already kind of mentioned. So Stephen, if you have more detailed question, just reach out to us. We have like 6 more minutes, so that's why I'm out. So there's a question about Cove tool. Have you used this Revit plugin? And so do you find it's useful? Claire, that's maybe something for you.
Yeah, we are actually embarking on folding in Cove tool to our building performance software suite this month. And I am not familiar enough with it to know how that carbon calculator works, but I did see that comment in the chat and thought, oh yeah, that's probably one we missed on our calculator page. And I guess, a note on these different calculators in general, and Sean had that image showing, measuring carbon for his family, all these different calculators had all these different results. Really, I think what matters most is just the relative comparison. And so, we're not trying to establish ourselves as the most accurate calculator. I think all calculators are inaccurate to some degree. And so it's more just getting in the practice of measuring, comparing design options, really using it as a tool to identify hot spots, but being consistent in your approach and how you use the tool and what tool you are using to be able to compare your design options within a project.
Excellent. Many supposedly sustainable and green products are sourced from China, i.e. lithium batteries for energy storage and solar panels, and not to mention the energy and environmental damage caused in extracting the raw materials for those products. Is this considered in the carbon calculator?
I mean, in terms of energy and batteries and things, no. There are some studies that have started happening within the CLF looking at MEP systems, because that's always been kind of a hole in all of the work that's been done. Similarly, they had done some work on interiors previously as well. I don't know, Claire, if you know more about any development along that regard.
Yeah, I think this is part of the reason why we are trying to stick to that upfront scope. We're not including transportation to site. There's beyond the question of material sustainability, there's also starting to be talk of the human impacts of certain material production, even within the US. And I think, the batteries, PV, these are kind of hot button issues for that, for sure. I think this also starts to dig into your tiers of emissions. Some of you may be familiar with this scope 1 versus scope 2 versus scope 3. And as you sort of move along these tiers, you're sort of widening out the system boundaries. So you have just the product you're looking at now versus all the carbon associated with all the activity around that product, including, say, worker transportation to site. And I think, this sounds like one of those scope 3 tier emissions. So I agree with you, Sean. I think people are looking into it, but we are definitely no experts in that realm. And yeah, not something we plan on including in this version.
Thank you. So here's the last one, and a quick one, hopefully from Vikas. Do you specify maximum global warming potential for steel and concrete mixes in your specifications? What is the best approach to have T's and specs to control embodied carbon of steel and concrete?
I'm going to point you all back to the Carbon Leadership Forum because they have some really great resources on this, including example specifications that start to show you how you might include global warming potential limits. I will say that, I don't know, 2-3 years ago, when we started talking about this as a team, there was a lot of hesitancy and just worrying about, you know, limiting suppliers or, you know, being able to, generally speaking, include something like that in our specifications. And I think especially around concrete, maybe less so steel, but certainly I think that's, you know, coming, especially as these Buy Clean Acts and other things start to be more widespread. We did just include max GWP limit for concrete mix design on our project just the other week, and it was relatively painless to include. So there's a lot of progress happening in that realm generally these days. But again, I think the Carbon Leadership Forum is a really great resource to start to dive into all of that.
Excellent, thank you. And we are on time, running a little bit out of time. I know there are some additional questions. Feel free to reach out to us. As Sarah mentioned, I'd like to, first of all, thank Claire and Sean for an excellent presentation. We had such a great turnout here. We hope this was an informative session for you. You'll find the webinar on the AIA California website, as well as our presentation slides. We are here for you to answer any additional questions, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you so much. Keep up the good work. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.